They don't say it. They don't explain it. But it's there, under the surface, quiet, constant, driving more than you realize. Because for them, needing someone does not feel romantic. It feels dangerous. And the moment they feel it, something changes. Not in you, in them. Emotional dependence is not just closeness. To an avoidance system, it feels like exposure. To need someone means you are no longer fully in control. Your emotional state is now influenced by another person, their presence, their absence, their response, their silence. And that shift is where the fear begins. Because control has always been their way of staying stable, not control over others, control over themselves, their emotions, their needs, their reactions. So when connection starts to matter, it introduces something new, uncertainty, because now how they feel is no longer completely self-contained. It's affected by you, by the connection, by what is building between you. And at first, this doesn't feel like fear. It feels like closeness, like something real, like something they didn't expect. They open, they engage, they lean in, and for a moment, they allow it. The connection grows. It deepens. It becomes meaningful. And then, something shifts. Not because the connection changed, because their awareness did. They start noticing how much it matters, how much they think about you, how much your presence affects them, how much your absence is felt. And that awareness doesn't just feel like love, it feels like risk. Because now you have impact, and impact means influence, and influence means vulnerability. Because if someone can affect you, they can also hurt you, disappoint you, leave you, change. And for a system that learned early to rely on itself, this is not comfortable. It's destabilizing. So the fear doesn't show up as panic. It shows up as subtle resistance, a need to rebalance, to reduce how much you matter, to regain internal control. And this is where the behavior begins, not as rejection, as regulation. They slow things down. They create space. They shift the energy, not dramatically, just enough to feel like themselves again. Because being close started to feel like losing something. Their independence, their emotional control, their ability to not need. And needing feels like dependency, and dependency feels like danger, not logically, but emotionally. Because in their system, dependence was never safe. It was something to avoid, to outgrow, to protect against. So even when they cared deeply, even when the connection is real, a part of them is watching, tracking, measuring. How much do I need this? How much is this affecting me? How much am I losing myself in this? And once that number feels too high, the system responds, not by ending everything, but by adjusting, creating space, reducing intensity, pulling back just enough to feel stable again. And this is where it becomes confusing, because from the outside, nothing obvious happened. The connection was good, the energy was there, the closeness was growing, and suddenly, something feels different. Not gone, but changed, less open, less present, less emotionally available. And it feels like a shift you can't explain, because it didn't come from conflict. It came from closeness. And that's what makes this pattern so hard to understand. Because the closer you get, the more it activates. Not because you did something wrong, because something inside them is being triggered. The fear of needing, the fear of depending, the fear of not being able to detach. And that fear does not ask for permission. It moves the system quietly, consistently, without being spoken. And unless you understand that, you will keep trying to fix something that was never about your behavior. It was about what closeness represents to them. Not just connection, but loss of control, loss of independence, loss of emotional safety. And once you see that, everything starts to make more sense. Not easier, but clearer. Because now you're not asking, what did I do wrong? You're seeing, this activated something they don't know how to hold. And that realization is the beginning of understanding, a fear that is rarely spoken, but constantly present. The fear does not stay hidden. Once the connection deepens, it starts to shape how they experience you, not in obvious ways, in subtle ones. Because once emotional dependence is felt, the system begins to respond, not with words, with adjustment. They don't say, I'm starting to rely on you. They don't explain that something feels too strong. They notice it internally, quietly, and that awareness creates tension because now the connection is no longer neutral. It has impact. It affects their mood, their attention, their internal state. They think about you more than before. They feel your absence more than before. They wait for your messages. They notice your tone. And all of that starts to feel like a loss of control. Not dramatic, but noticeable. And for someone who has learned to stay self contained, that shift does not feel safe. It feels unfamiliar, unstable, risky, because now they are not just in a connection, they are influenced by it. And influence means dependency, even if it's small, even if it's natural, even if it's normal. To them, it still registers. And once it registers, the system reacts, not by ending things, by regulating them. They begin to adjust their behavior. Small changes, barely visible, but consistent. They take longer to respond, not to ignore you, to create space. They keep conversations lighter, not because they don't care, because depth increases attachment. They avoid certain moments, certain topics, certain levels of vulnerability, because those moments make the connection feel stronger, and stronger starts to feel like dependence. So instead of moving closer, they slow it down. They soften the intensity. They reduce the emotional pace. And from the outside, this feels like a shift, because it is, not in feelings, in regulation. They are not disconnecting from you. They are controlling how much you affect them. And that difference is everything. Because from your side, it feels like inconsistency. One moment they are fully there, open, engaged, present. The next moment, something changes. They are still there, but less expressive, less responsive, less emotionally available. And there is no clear reason, no conflict, no argument, no event that explains it, just a quiet shift in energy. And that's what makes it confusing, because nothing is clearly wrong, but something is clearly different. And your system feels it, even if you can't explain it, because what you're sensing is not rejection, it's regulation. The moment the connection started to matter more, they started managing it more, not because they wanted distance, because they needed stability. And to them, stability means not depending too much, not needing too much, not being affected too much. So they reduce the impact, not all at once, gradually, through small shifts, small pauses, small emotional limits. And over time, those small adjustments create something bigger, a connection that exists, but is controlled, felt, but contained, close, but not fully allowed to deepen. And unless you see that clearly, you will keep trying to respond to the moments instead of recognizing the pattern, because the pattern is not random. It follows a specific logic. The closer it gets, the more it is regulated, the more it matters, the more it is managed, the more they feel, the more they pull back, just enough to feel in control again. And that's the paradox, the very thing that creates closeness also activates the need for distance. Not because the connection is wrong, because dependency feels unsafe. And until that changes, closeness will always be followed by subtle distance, not loudly, not clearly, but consistently. And once you see that, you stop trying to understand it as mixed signals. You start seeing it as a system protecting itself from something it was never taught how to hold. The feeling of needing someone, the feeling of depending, the feeling of not being fully in control. And that is the fear they rarely say out loud, but constantly respond to. Once that pattern LMK becomes active, it doesn't stop at small adjustments. It begins to shape the entire connection. Because now it's not just about managing moments, it's about managing the level of closeness overall. And that changes how everything feels. Not suddenly, gradually, but consistently. They start to relate to you differently, not in how much they care, in how much they allow themselves to feel. Because feeling more means needing more, and needing more means losing control. So the system tightens, not visibly, internally. They begin to monitor their own reactions, how often they think about you, how much they look for you, how much they rely on you to feel okay. And once they notice that increase, they respond, not by disconnecting, by dialing it down. They become more self-contained, more focused on themselves, more intentional about creating space, not because they don't want you, because they don't want to need you. And that distinction is important, because from the outside, it feels like you're being pulled away from, but from the inside, they are pulling themselves back, back into control, back into independence, back into a place where their emotional state belongs to them. And that shift creates a new dynamic, one where closeness no longer expands naturally. It becomes something that rises, then gets reduced, rises, then gets adjusted, rises, then gets contained. And over time, you start to feel that ceiling, that invisible point where things stop deepening, not because there's nothing there, because something is holding it back. You reach a moment of real connection, a deeper conversation, a more open exchange, a stronger emotional presence. And right after that, something changes. They slow down. They pull back slightly. They become less expressive, less engaged, not gone, but reduced. And that sequence starts to repeat. Enough times for you to notice. Enough times for your system to respond. Because now you are not just experiencing connection. You are experiencing interruption. Not loud, but consistent. And that creates a specific kind of tension. The tension of almost close, almost secure, almost fully connected, but never fully arriving. And that almost keeps you engaged because it feels within reach, like something you can access. If you just understand it better, if you adjust slightly, if you give the right amount of space, if you don't push too much. But what you're actually responding to is not a temporary phase, it's a regulated pattern. Because every time closeness increases, dependency increases. And every time dependency increases, the system reacts. It creates distance, not to end the connection, to rebalance it, to bring it back to a level that feels safe. And that level is always lower than what the connection could become. And once you see that, you begin to understand why it feels the way it does, why it never fully settles, why it never fully opens, why it keeps moving without stabilizing. Because it's not meant to, not in its current state. It's being held within a limit defined by how much they can tolerate needing someone. And anything beyond that gets reduced, softened, redirected, not intentionally, but consistently. And this is where your awareness deepens. Because now, you're not just feeling the inconsistency, you're seeing the mechanism behind it. You're seeing that the pullback is not random. It follows closeness. It follows depth. It follows emotional intensity. And that pattern tells you something clear. This is not about compatibility in the way you first thought. It's about capacity, their capacity to stay open, to stay present, to stay connected, without needing to regain control. And if that capacity has a limit, then the connection will keep returning to that limit, no matter how strong it feels, no matter how real it is, no matter how much potential you see in it, because potential does not override pattern. And once you see that, you stop chasing the moments and start recognizing the structure, a structure where closeness exists, but only up to a point, where connection is real, but not fully allowed to expand, where you can feel something, but not fully build it. And that realization is not easy, but it is clear, because now you understand. You were not imagining it. You were not overthinking. You were not expecting too much. You were sensing a connection that was being held within limits. Limits created by a fear that is never spoken, but always present. The fear of becoming emotionally dependent. Once you see this clearly, something shifts inside you. Not suddenly, but deeply, because now you're no longer trying to understand isolated moments. You're seeing the whole pattern, and that changes how you relate to it. You stop reacting to every small shift. You stop analyzing every message. You stop trying to decode every change in tone, because now you know what's underneath it. A system that cannot fully relax into dependence. A system that equates closeness with loss of control. A system that will always rebalance itself when things get too real. And that awareness creates distance in you. Not cold distance, clear distance. You start noticing what you feel more honestly, the inconsistency, the emotional gaps, the way closeness never fully holds, the way connection rises, then gets reduced. And instead of explaining it away, you start acknowledging it fully, without softening it, without minimizing it, without making excuses for it. Because now you're not confused. You're aware. And awareness changes your behavior. You stop overextending to maintain connection. You stop offering more depth than what's being met. You stop filling the emotional space on your own because you realize something important. You cannot create mutual closeness by yourself. You cannot stabilize something that is being regulated from the other side. You cannot build depth where depth is being limited. And that realization can feel heavy because it confronts the hope, the almost, the feeling that something real is there if you just hold on a little longer. But now you see the truth. It's not about time. It's not about effort. It's about capacity. Their capacity to stay open without pulling back. Their capacity to tolerate emotional dependence. Their capacity to remain present when closeness starts to matter deeply. And if that capacity is limited, then the connection will keep returning to that limit. No matter how much you give, no matter how much you understand, no matter how patient you are. And this is where your choice begins. Not about changing them, about choosing what you stay in. Because now you have clarity. You can see what the connection is, not what it could be, not what it almost feels like, but what it consistently is. A connection that opens, then regulates, deepens, then pulls back, feels real, then becomes distant. And once you see that, you cannot pretend it's something else. You cannot go back to not knowing. You cannot keep investing the same way without feeling the cost, because the cost becomes clear. You start to feel what you've been adjusting, how much you've been holding back, how much you've been shrinking to stay aligned, how much you've been managing yourself to keep the connection stable. And that awareness brings a question, a real one, not emotional, honest. Can this actually meet me? Not in moments, not occasionally, but consistently. Can this connection hold the level of closeness I naturally move toward? Can it sustain depth without reducing it? Can it remain open without needing to pull back? And if the answer keeps showing you the same pattern, then the clarity is already there. Not something you need to wait for, not something you need to prove, something you've already experienced. And this is where you stop negotiating with reality. You stop trying to turn partial closeness into full connection. You stop accepting inconsistency as something you need to adapt to. You stop telling yourself, this is just how it is, because now you know better. You know what full connection should feel like. Not perfect, but stable. Not overwhelming, but open. Not controlled, but mutual. And once that standard becomes clear, you stop settling for anything that consistently falls below it. Not out of anger, not out of frustration, out of alignment. Because you realize something simple. You don't need to fight for closeness with someone who fears it. You don't need to earn depth with someone who regulates it. You don't need to prove your worth to someone who is protecting their independence from being affected. You need someone who can meet you in it, who can stay when it deepens, who can remain open when it matters more, who does not feel the need to reduce connection just to feel safe. And that shift is where everything changes, because now you are no longer focused on how to make it work. You are focused on whether it actually works for you. And that brings your power back, not as control, as clarity. You stop chasing potential. You start choosing a reality. You stop investing in almost. You start aligning with what is real. And that decision, even if it's quiet, even if it's internal, is the moment everything begins to change. Because now you are no longer available for a connection that requires you to reduce yourself be to keep it. You are no longer participating in something that cannot grow with you. You are no longer confusing presence with availability. You are choosing something different, something stable, something mutual, something that does not need to be managed to survive. And if this landed for you, not just in your mind, but in your body, comment, I choose real closeness, not for anyone else, for you. Because that moment, when you stop trying to make limited connection feel complete and start choosing what can actually meet you, that's the moment you stop repeating the same pattern and start creating something real. If you want to keep going deeper into this, stay with the inner Odyssey, because once you understand these patterns clearly, you don't just see relationships differently, you choose them differently. And that's where everything changes.